Hey there, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of the Family Law Insider podcast. Today we have a show with a twist. Summer is knocking at our back door in Phoenix, and what that means is Comic-Con is almost here. And according to the website for Comic-Con, it's a chance to celebrate pop culture and embrace your inner geek, and that's what we're going to do today. But as always, we're going to do it in the context of family law. And today I have a special guest who is sort of a comic book villain and superhero expert. His name is James Daly, and not only is he a lawyer, but he's an author or a co-author of a book. It's called The Law of Superheroes, and he's also the co-founder of the popular blog called Law in the Multiverse. Welcome, James, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, James, I've never actually been to Comic-Con, and I have to be honest, I don't know a lot about the superheroes beyond the mainstream villains and heroes like Batman, Superman, but literally, are there hundreds more villains and superheroes than the general public knows about?
At least hundreds, maybe thousands. There certainly have been tens of thousands of individual comic books, unique comic book issues written since comic books as we think of them today really started getting going in the 1930s. And in that time, the comic book authors have created just countless heroes and villains and other characters of all kinds.
So what is it about comic books that is so interesting to people? Why do we keep reading them?
Well, in terms of the general public, I think people like it because they have the opportunity to tell these larger-than-life stories, but they still have these archetypes, these tropes, these common expressions of heroes and villains and kinds of things, but then they blow it up even bigger. And so, you have the common kinds of themes and stories that everybody's been telling for millennia, but we know these days, there's no such thing as magic or whatever, and so but we still want to have these myths. We still want to tell stories about Hercules, and so since we can't say that, that he's the son of Zeus or whatever, we tell the story of Superman, an alien from another planet. So it provides that kind of outlet. And in terms of the law, and people who are interested in that, because we have hundreds of characters being talked about. It provides an enormous wealth of stories and hypotheticals to discuss.
And and that brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you right at the beginning, James. Like, how long have you been interested in comic books? Because it sounds like you're really well versed in villains and superheroes. Has that been going on a while?
Well, so I'm not quite old enough to have watched the Batman TV series with Adam West when it was new, but I did watch it on TV when I was a kid, and when I was 5 or 6 years old, and that was probably my first exposure to it. And I started reading comic books, going to the comic book store and picking up comic books when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, and so that's sort of really what got me interested in comic books at that age.
So how did you come to intertwine your love for comic books with the law? How did that happen? Because that's interesting, and that's an excellent way to kind of spin something that I've never heard of anybody doing until recently.
Well, it actually came about as part of a dinner conversation with a couple of friends of mine and my wife, and the topic of the conversation came to Superman and his X-ray vision, which I think most people know that Superman can see through walls. And that he's from another planet, and the thought was, well, if everybody on that planet had X-ray vision, then their privacy laws would have to be very different, or they'd all have to line their walls with lead. Now, I should say, for anybody who's familiar with Superman, that I know that not everybody on Krypton has superpowers. That Superman's powers come from his exposure to Earth's yellow sun, and that not everybody on Krypton can see through walls. Every time I tell this story, I have to point that out, or else people get on to me for that.
Right.
But anyway, we were talking about that, and a friend of ours who was there said, you should start a blog about that kind of thing, and that he would read it, and that'd be at least one person. So that's I sort of put it out there kind of on a lark and thought that would be a fun thing to do, and it turned out to be pretty popular.
Okay.
I should say, for the record, that it turns out that we were not the first people to do this. Other people have done it before. We weren't aware of any of them when I started the blog, but a few other people have looked at comic books in this kind of way.
Okay, cool. Well, I appreciate that honesty there. Um, so, in terms of superheroes, like I mentioned before, the only ones that I know are the mainstream ones. I think the ones that most of us hear about, Wonder Woman, or the ones that I grew up watching on TV, the superheroes, I don't even remember what they were called. I remember the Wonder Twins, but so one thing in thinking about superheroes that seem common to the ones that I know about is the fact that they have these they have these human qualities, that they're human in one world and then they're superheroes in another world. I mean, is that just the case for every superhero out there? Is part of them human or the main part? Or is there just heroes who are just superheroes, period? They don't have this human aspect. Does that make sense?
You mean secret identities, that they don't have a day-to-day existence like Clark Kent?
Exactly.
The Superman is a mild-mannered reporter, Clark Kent, that kind of thing. The
Yeah.
Batman is Bruce Wayne, the billionaire. Yeah, there are some superheroes who, in the comic books or in movies or whatever, who are out, you might say, who don't have a secret identity, who are publicly known as who they are, and sometimes it's because they can't hide it, because of their physical appearance, for example. So one of the Fantastic Four, who you might be familiar with from there were some movies, for example, known as the Thing, whose real name is Ben Grimm. As part of the transformation that gave him his superhuman strength, he also took on a mottled orange, rocky appearance, as though his skin was made of kind of like of stones, and you can't really hide that, and so
Right.
it's kind of public knowledge. That's who he is, and then that dealing with that is part of his character, and so there are other characters who maybe could choose to live a private life but don't, and that's something that it just depends.
Okay. Well, the superheroes that I love, well, Wonder Woman, for example, I loved her because it's all about girl power, right? I can identify with Wonder Woman. And although not necessarily superheroes, like some of the comic book characters that were my favorites growing up were Archie, Betty, and Veronica, because I could relate to this love triangle, and as a child even. And so to me, like, comic books and superheroes are somewhat like a different type of soap opera. Would you agree with that or disagree?
No, I would absolutely agree with that. It's well known that in comic books, nobody ever really dies. Because once you've established this character that everybody knows and likes, or maybe even doesn't like, but at least they know who they are, you've bothered to work that out. You don't want to kill them off. You'd have to come up with a new one.
Exactly.
And so people do die, but they inevitably come back because they were resurrected. It turns out they never really killed, or they're reincarnated, or that was just a robot double, or whatever. There's a million ways to bring somebody back. So there's a saying in comic books that there's only a couple of people who are ever truly dead. That that Peter Parker's Uncle Ben is deceased, because that's a key part of his origin story, that he's dead. And similarly, Batman's parents are dead, and because again they have to be in order for him to become Batman. And that's that's about it. Pretty much
Yep.
everybody else comes back. And as a result, in some ways the world never really changes. People sort of have their love triangles and all that, but they don't really grow old and die, and they don't get killed, and the when the villains get caught, they don't stay in jail forever.
Right.
And so yeah, it's like a soap opera, because they have to keep finding ways to weave these new plot lines forever.
So, have comic books and the relationships that superheroes have they evolved with the times? And what I'm asking here specifically, because I don't know,
Yeah.
are there homosexual superheroes or characters in the comic book world?
Oh, absolutely. There are out characters. Maybe they're maybe not as well represented as they should be, or as many would like. Just as much as characters of color or of various other backgrounds are maybe not quite as well represented as they should be. But yeah, they do exist, and same-sex relationships are there, and the X-Men, for example, the mutants I don't know if you're so familiar with the movies, and actually there's a movie that just came out, X-Men: Days of Future
Right.
Past, that at various times throughout the history of that comic book, the idea of mutants as being well, they're among us, they look like us, but they're not really us. And they're different, they're dangerous, something needs to be done about it. That has been used as an allegory for different persecuted groups at different times. And when the X-Men were first created, that was often used as an allegory for the civil rights movement. And over time, it's been used as an allegory for homosexuals and the gay rights movement. So it's something that has been used in different ways over time.
So, do you think that the reflection of what might be happening in in current events in the real world, do you think that that is important to be reflected in comic books? Do you think there's a place for that? Because some people may just say, "Hey, listen, I don't need a comment on what's happening politically in the world. I just want to read a comic book and have a good time."
Well, I think that's definitely true. I think but I think the comic books are big enough to have both kinds of stories and more stories than that. So in the mid 2000s, there was a storyline called Marvel Civil War, where there was what happened. The very short version is that some characters killed some people with their superpowers, and there was a big push by the government to make all superpowered people have to register with the government. And this caused all the people to split into pro-registration and anti-registration camps. And it was also basically all the big allegory for dealing with terrorism and what to do after something like 9/11. Should we really double down on the security state and have a lot of registration and surveillance and national security infrastructure, or should we say, no, look, people are basically okay, the price of freedom is that occasionally bad things will happen and we can live with that, it's worth it, or whatever. And you know, whether the story was well written or not is not really the point. The point is that you know, those kinds of stories I think are worth having, but there's also there are just stories that are just, hey, let's have big fights or soap
Right.
operas or whatever. And I think
Yep.
that if you go to a comic book store today, you'll see dozens of different comic books on the racks, and there's room for everything.
So you can choose whatever you want. So what's the state of marriage in comic book world? I mean, do
Well,
superheroes get married, and do they stay married?
they both get married, and they stop being married. And again, it's that soap opera thing. They need to get married because that gives you a plot to talk about. You know, the love story that leads to it, the whole lead up to the wedding itself. You know, will they? Won't they? Will the wedding go forward? Will someone try to stop it? Will there be kids? And then also there's the need to eventually undo it somehow, because of course you can't stay that way, because you have to go back
Right.
to the status quo ante. So, for example, there was a Spider-Man plot line where Spider-Man, Peter Parker, ended up being able to marry his sweetheart Mary Jane, but it ultimately had to be undone. And there was there's been another plot line I can think of where a character married somebody, but it turned out they were an alien who could change their appearance. They were a shapeshifter. And
Interesting.
yeah, it was all part of a plot by the aliens to learn their secrets. And
That
so that
that
had
could be that
that's
could be grounds for an annulment.
right.
Is that how they got unhitched, or do you know?
I don't recall off the top of my head how that was rounded out, but it was something I wrote about on the blog. I just don't, that was a couple of years ago. I don't quite remember how that worked out. But marriage is a fraught topic in comic books, because so many of the classic comic book characters like Superman are not technically human. You know, Superman is an alien from Krypton, and
Right.
so if they marry, and there aren't very many Kryptonians on Earth. In many cases, he's the only one. Sometimes there's some others, but generally speaking, he's the only one. So if Superman marries Lois Lane, you know, his common sweetheart, and she's a normal human woman, is that even legal? I
Yeah.
think quite arguably not.
Yeah.
And so that's complicated. Uh, and
Are
similar.
these sorry? Are these topics that the heroes talk about in their relationships in the comic books in terms of how they're going to get past it or resolve it or deal with it?
No, for the most part, they don't. They don't, which is kind of the odd thing. In Superman's case, for example, it's generally totally glossed over the legal implications of the fact that he's not human. It's pretty rare for the comics just to point out that, hey, wait a minute, he's not human. Does he even have rights? If somebody tries to, if a villain tries to kill Superman, is that attempted murder, or is it animal abuse? So generally speaking, most people sort of use if it acts like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck kind of thing, where he looks human, acts human, everybody treats him like a human, so legally he must be human, right? Well, maybe. Probably not, I think, personally, but it's not a very popular opinion. Most people seem to want Superman to be treated like a legal person.
Yeah.
But yeah, in another case, there's a character called Swamp Thing, who's this sort of shambling plant creature, and in some versions, Swamp Thing is just an elemental force of nature. He's basically plants come alive to defend nature. But in another version, he's a human person who ended up sort of becoming a plant-human hybrid, and he ends up falling in love with a woman. And there was a question about whether or not their relationship would be illegal in Louisiana. There was some question about that, so yeah, there's some all kinds of some interesting issues with relationships in comic books.
I remember the Swamp Thing movie from the 80s. I never read the comic book, but I do remember that. I think Adrienne Barbeau was the beautiful woman with whom the Swamp Thing fell in love with. It was a good movie. I liked it back then. Yeah, it's really interesting. So, like, is the undoing of the relationships ever, the main topic of plot lines in terms of, whatever, we have to undo this for whatever reason, or it's an unhealthy relationship? Is it ever at the forefront?
It definitely was at the forefront of the case in the Peter Parker Mary Jane case. In fact, the way it was undone involved a literal deal with the devil. Peter Parker had made a deal with Mephisto, essentially the Marvel Comics version of the devil, and it was a Faustian bargain. The point of the deal was not to undo the relationship, but that was the side effect. That was sort of the catch. But yeah, so yeah, that definitely comes to it. So they didn't divorce in the usual sense. It was literally undone by demonic forces.
So is there divorce in the usual sense in the comic book world?
I'm sure it has come up. I can't think of any cases off the top of my head, but I'm sure it's come up. Yeah, I'm sure it's happened.
Okay.
Like I say, there have been so many tens of thousands of comic books. Virtually every legal issue you can imagine has come up at one point or another, directly or indirectly.
So let's talk domestic violence. Is there domestic violence in the comic book world?
Sadly, yes. It is all too often the case that female characters are hurt or killed sort of to advance the plot line of a male character, and this a phenomenon called women in refrigerators, because there's a male character, who came home one day to discover I believe it was his wife, whose body she'd been killed and her body was put in a refrigerator, and the point was just that the sole point of her death was to give him something to be upset about. Now that's not domestic violence. In the sense that he didn't kill her, but yes, but domestic violence does exist. There are cases where there are abusive relationships and that kind of thing, and it's often done as a way to establish something about the male character, either to show that a villain is a bad guy because he abuses his wife or girlfriend, or to show that the effects of alcoholism or something like that. Again, a concrete example I can think of is the relationship between the Joker and Harley Quinn.
Uh-huh.
Is a very abusive. One might say I'm not a psychologist, but one might say codependent relationship, where the Joker is the sort of classic Batman villain that I think we're probably pretty familiar with, and Harley
Yeah.
Quinn is a woman who was I want to say psychiatrist, definitely a mental health worker, who was treating him and fell in love with him and sort of became obsessive about him. Ended up, I believe, ended up helping him break out of Arkham Asylum and then joined him in crime, and is very obsessively devoted to him, but he mistreats her terribly and oftentimes physically,
Wow.
and so they are not, I don't think, in a formal legal relationship. I don't think they're married or anything, but in most versions of the story, but they definitely have a relationship, and it's typically pretty abusive.
So that's interesting, James. And I know from my real world experience in divorce law that there are plenty of cases, but they're really not out there, so to speak, of men who are the victims of a domestically violent case or situation. Do you know of any comic book characters where the roles might be reversed and the man is the one who is abused?
It wouldn't shock me if that's been done, just because again there are so many stories out there. But I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Okay. So one of the big stories about domestic violence that I know a little bit about is the story of Ant-Man.
Hmm.
And I don't. Do you mind sharing? Do you know anything about Ant-Man? And is there a movie coming out any time soon about
Uh,
Ant-Man?
there is an Ant-Man movie coming out this year, late this year or next year. I think maybe next year. Um, but yeah, it's part of the Marvel universe, and it'll be a new character for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He hasn't been featured yet, but yeah, that is. There have been a few different people who have been Ant-Man in the comics, and I don't actually know which one is going to be in the movie, but at least one of them has had some significant relationship issues.
I think it's Hank. Is it Hank Pym or I don't know how to
Yeah,
say it. Pym.
uh,
Pym.
I've always heard it pronounced Pym. Yeah.
Okay, and his wife, from what I understand, is Wasp. The Wasp.
Hmm.
And I don't know for sure, but I heard that that's going to be the focus of the upcoming movie, and I think that Michael Douglas is at least one of the people in the movie. I don't know who's actually going to be Ant-Man.
Mm.
But I for one, I think that the comic books are a great way to bring out some of the issues that we have in society, and it sounds like that's what they have done throughout the years. Really kind of hash out the things that we deal with as humans.
Yeah, I
Uh,
agree. And one of the nice things about comic books is that because they are so large and so broad, and because of the frequent use of alternate realities, where you have and one version of a character, and then you have another version of a character in another reality, it provides us the opportunity to say, well, here's what the character is like here, and here's what they're like there, and we can see how the law treats these two different situations.
So,
Um,
so speaking of how the law treats certain situations, can you tell us a little more about your book?
Well, yeah, so the book originally came out in 2012, and the softcover came out last October, and it sort of collects together a lot of what we've written on the blog, and then organizes it and updates it, and there's a fair amount of new material in there as well. It also has illustrations. Excerpts from comic books to help provide some context for people who may not be quite so familiar with some of these characters. We try to use examples from major comic books that people are so familiar with where possible, but sometimes we have to go a little further afield, and especially in those cases, we try to provide some illustrations so people know what we're talking about. And Yeah, we think the chapters are all organized by an area of law, so torts or criminal law or constitutional law, and we try to provide a kind of a 30,000-foot view of some of the major legal issues in each of those areas, just to give people a flavor of what that's like, and how it's all put together from the using comic books as an examples from comic books to help explain it.
So I think that's a really interesting way to approach the law, and I wish that there had been a book around like that when I went through law school. Do you know if anybody's using your book as a text in any law schools?
I don't know if they're using it as a text, but I know that at least a few professors have referenced it or suggested it in their courses, and I've given a guest lecture in a course talking about some of these same issues. So yeah, there's definitely some interest in using it in the academic setting.
So everybody check out the book, and it's available all kinds of places, and I'll link to them in the show notes. And I think that's going to do it for this episode. James, I really appreciate the time that you've given me. And could you tell everybody how they can find more of you and the co-founder of your blog?
Sure. My co-author is Ryan Davidson, and the website is lawandthemultiverse.com. We can also be found on Twitter at lawatmultiverse, and we're on Facebook at facebook.com/lawandthemultiverse, I believe.
Okay, so everybody take a look if you want to get back to your childhood and have some fun and maybe learn something about the world in the process. Let's read some comic books. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Family Law Insider podcast. Remember, we're on your side when it matters most, and I will see you next time.